Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I will show you how I made Elsa's bodice. If you have not already seen my video on the embroidery or patterning this dress, I highly recommend watching them before this video since I will not be covering those aspects of the costume in this video. I've listed the materials used in the description below as well as where you can purchase them and about how much I used. So let's jump right into the construction process of Elsa's bodice. I started by cutting out my pattern on coutil. This is going to be my lining and structure layer of the bodice, and we'll get several pieces of boning in order to help create the shape I am going for. I marked all 4 darts with water-soluble chalk, and then I pinned my darts together to prepare them for sewing. On a 2.5mm stitch length, I sew my darts without backstitching at the top so I can hand tie the thread tails together when I'm done. Now my new favorite step, overcasting. I overcast the top, sides, and bottom of my pieces to help minimize the fraying while working with the pieces. I do this because it's just a bit quicker than pulling out my serger, changing the thread, and to do that for such small pieces. Now, if I was doing this for an entire gown, I would reconsider, but this works for the bodice. I normally do this step before I add my darts or any kind of sewing, but I kind of spaced out on it, so I am totally doing this right now instead. I highly recommend doing this before darts. It does create like a weird bulk at the bottom, and it makes your darts go in a certain direction, so don't space out. Don't be a space cadet! With my newly overcast edges, I will now sew the front to the back at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to add the boning channels. I used leftover hooping channels from when I made Ariel's hoop skirt, but any kind of twill tape wider than your boning will work. I think this is a 1/2 inch or maybe 3/4 of an inch. I placed a boning channel in the center front, along each of the 4 darts, and on each seam for a total of 7 channels. If you want to place more, you can. Also, don't mind my black thread everywhere. I reuse boning channels from the ones I used on the mock-up because I had an epiphany while making my mock-up on how much waste mock-ups can make, so I'm trying to reuse as many pieces from that as I can. To sew down the channel, I try to get about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the channel so I have enough room for my boning because I'm sewing on each side of the channel, and I really want to make sure that I can get my boning into the channel. Next, I add the boning to the channels. Again, I pre-cut all of these for the mock-up and I'm just reusing them. I used a 1/4 inch spiral steel boning that I bought on a continuous roll. I capped the edges with heat shrink tubing and they slid into their channels pretty easily. Now I am going to cut out the satin, mark the darts with chalk, and this time I remembered to overcast my edges before sewing the darts. And then I will sew the darts. I also pressed my seams open and my darts away from the center. Time to cut out the upper bodice pieces on the chiffon. I'm going to pin the chiffon so that the bottom of it lines up with the top of the darts. I actually marked this on the pattern after the fact so I wouldn't forget, but I basically went off of memory from when I was draping the pattern earlier that day. Now I'm going to baste this down. I'm basting this down because the next step is to satin stitch it down, and I just want to make that step a little bit easier for me. I also fold the back edges in since this part will not have the zipper. And I sew the sleeve shoulder type seam as well. Now time for the satin stitch. My machine has it programmed into it, but I still did a few tests to make sure that my tension and width were where I wanted them. If you do not have a satin stitch on your machine, you can make one with a very tight zigzag stitch. And if you don't know what I mean by that, I would recommend watching a tutorial on how to do a satin stitch with a zigzag stitch because it is also how I create the decorative stitches on the bodice later on when I work on this skirt as well. I made sure to use Floriani Heat N Stay tearaway stabilizer under my satin stitch for stability. This is a very important part of doing the satin stitch. The next step was to draw on the detail stitching from Elsa's bodice. This was a disaster for me. I used my yellow chalk on the top of the fabric since obviously I'm going to sew the detail on the top of the fabric, and my initial design was not exactly where I wanted it. So I went to wipe away the chalk and it didn't go away. I was pretty upset and I thought I had to scrap the piece and start over, but instead I just moved forward and redrew the stitch in water-soluble pencil, which did come off when I wiped it away. And I continued on with the stitch. After satin stitching the entire design, I took OxyClean to the chalk and it did go away. For now. I let it dry overnight and came back to no markings in the morning, but I'll share with you later that this was not the end of the chalk fiasco. I did learn a very valuable lesson though, and that's to test chalk on every type of fabric despite if you think it's supposed to go away or not. This is also chalk that I purchased specifically. It's Taylor's chalk, and I've never had an issue with it not coming off, so I'm not sure if it was just the chalk with the satin combination or what, but I was pretty sad. Okay, so this is where we started with our sleeve pattern, and I just really hated the shape of this front. I thought it looked awful, and the way I wanted it to go down my sleeve, it ended up on my pinky versus my middle finger, which isn't exactly how I want it. And so then I decided to ixnay that idea and just get a straighter one, straighter hem. I lengthened it though because that was way too short, and I also widened it quite a bit. And so then after testing it, here's my paper copy, and we're going to cut this out on the pre-embroidered fabric and overcast the edges. So this is where I'm at with the sleeves. I will get some more footage of the sleeves once I've added all of the details and talk about how I did them. Okay, so here is the stoned sleeve, and these are just stones that I think I got off of Wish or Amazon or eBay or something, but I got them somewhere. They were in my stash. These are the Bohemian stones, and these ones are going to be all over the dress. So I started with them here, and they're going to be on the cape and everything. The next step for the sleeves are going to be to sew these right sides together, and I'm not going to get any footage of me sewing them together, but essentially I'll just start, and on my pattern I have a notch that I will make sure to mark and get it all pinned together, and then I will sew them onto the bodice before I throw the lining in there. But I'm pretty happy with these. I think that it turned out pretty good, and I'm glad I used blue instead of just a regular stone, because I'm going to actually be using these inside the diamonds as well. So it's, you know, nice repetition. It's also breaks up the color a little bit, so it's not just all white. So now I'm ready to start applying the embroidery pieces I made. To do this, I'm using Mighty Fuse from So Much Cosplay. This is a double-sided webbing that I've used before, and I will link a video to a tutorial on how to use it in the cards. So I'm going to start by tracing out every piece I plan to fuse onto the bodice. This is over 80 pieces, so in order to be less wasteful, I try to get all of the pieces as close as I can to each other. I also trace this on the waxier side of Mighty Fuse versus the other side, because that's the side that has the glue on it. When I cut the pieces out, I actually try to cut them slightly inside the lines so that there will be no fusible residue visible on my bodice after fusing it. My goal is to fuse these pieces as close to the edge as I can get. Now I'm going to fuse the webbing to the wrong side of the embroidery by holding my iron to it for 5 seconds at a time. I'd like to welcome the debut of my Oliso Mini to this channel. This iron was the perfect size for working with such small items. Still has the heat I need from a normal size iron, but the size just made it easier for me to meticulously place all the pieces that I needed to. Next, it's time to fuse the embroidery to the bodice. This is where our lovely chalk fiasco rears its ugly head. So, to fuse the embroidery, I press the pieces onto the bodice after tearing off the waxy paper. With the wrong side of the design to the right side of my bodice, I press and hold the iron to the piece with a cotton pressing cloth. This is where I learned that the yellow chalk that I thought I had cleaned had actually just dispersed itself throughout the garment, and when I applied heat to it, the chalk made its final appearance. There was literally nothing I could do at this point, and where it's really yellow on the inside, on the outside you can still see the faint chalk lines from before. Luckily, the camera doesn't seem to pick it up, but if I ever wear this in person, it's not going to be very attractive. For the smaller pieces, I actually press and fuse it from the top side of the fabric. I'm so pleasantly surprised with how well this holds to the chiffon without fusing to anything underneath or leaving any weird residues. I did test it before the piece you see here, but I'm still so happy with how it turned out. Alright, so I have finally ironed all of the diamonds, all of them, so many of them. They're ironed. They're all in the same process that you saw me do with the top ones here, and I think I've repeated them down here. So now I'm going to insert a time lapse of me rhinestoning them. I'll try to keep it really short, like 10 seconds, but the rhinestoning process will take me a good hour or so. And then once I've rhinestoned, I will be slip stitching the lining into this. And I'm doing that 100% by hand because of how everything is made. So that is this step. Yay! Okay, so I just machine stitched down the cotil lining to my my satin piece, and like on this edge I left a gap here so I can fold this down below, and I did it all the way around the bottom and then obviously up to the other edge. So now we're just going to, I'm just gonna fold this down, and I want it to go right below my stitching here, and then all the way to the top, and I'm going to hand sew this down. I'm doing it this way because I just think that it'll look better. So yeah, this is the way that I have chosen to do this. And then once this is sewn, I will sew on my sleeves. And I did this, after trying them on again, I added a hook. I always forget that, like, even though I have small wrists, when I put sleeves on, my hands can't fit through the wrists, so we're just gonna have to hook it. But I will sew this into the armhole and then she'll be done. So I'll get some footage of that here when I am done hand sewing this top part. Thank you so much for watching this video on how I made Elsa's bodice from Frozen 2. Stay tuned next week for a video on the capelet, and the week after for one on the skirt. Make sure to subscribe to my channel. I upload videos every Wednesday and Sunday, and I hope to see you next time. Happy sewing!